Racist detective attacks black judge. Seconds later, he's shot on the spot. What if I told you that a single moment in a courthouse corridor could change everything? Picture this. The marble floors gleaming under fluorescent lights, the familiar echo of dress shoes clicking against polished stone, and the quiet dignity that fills these halls of justice. It's a place where right and wrong should be crystal clear, where respect and law reign supreme. But sometimes, the very people sworn to uphold justice can shatter that peace in an instant. Judge Marcus Williams had walked these corridors for 15 years, earning respect through fairness and wisdom. Detective Ray Morrison had patrolled the streets for just as long, building a reputation that would soon crumble. Their paths were about to cross in a way that would expose ugly truths and test the very foundations of justice itself. What happened next would send shockwaves through their entire community and change both men forever. Where are you watching from tonight? Judge Marcus Williams adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the morning's case files in his chambers. At 58, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from decades of public service. The son of a postal worker and a school teacher, Marcus had worked his way through law school, waiting tables, and studying by streetlight when the electricity got cut off. Those humble beginnings never left him. Even now, sitting in his leather chair with law books lining the walls, he remembered what it felt like to be underestimated. The Riverside County Courthouse buzzed with its usual morning energy. Lawyers shuffled papers, families whispered nervously in hallways, and court reporters prepared for another day of documenting human drama. Marcus had presided over thousands of cases here, from petty theft to complex civil disputes. His reputation for fairness transcended racial lines, something that didn't go unnoticed in a community still healing from decades of distrust. Between law enforcement and citizens, Detective Ray Morrison was having a different kind of morning. Sitting in his patrol car outside the courthouse, he gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The 45-year-old veteran cop had just received word that his latest arrest, a drug bust he was particularly proud of, might be thrown out due to procedural violations. 3 months of surveillance work down the drain. His partner had warned him about cutting corners, but Ray believed in results over paperwork. 22 years on this force, he muttered to himself, watching people stream into the courthouse. And some desk jockey's gonna tell me how to do my job. The frustration had been building for weeks. His arrest numbers were down, younger officers were getting promoted ahead of him, and his wife had been dropping hints about retirement. Ray felt the world changing around him in ways he didn't like. The case in question involved Jerome Washington, a 19-year-old college student from the east side of town. Ray had spotted Jerome walking through what he considered a high drug activity neighborhood, though locals knew it simply as the route home from the community college. When Ray found a small bag of marijuana in Jerome's backpack during a search, he felt vindicated. What he hadn't anticipated was Jerome's father hiring a sharp defense attorney who understood the nuances of probable cause. Marcus reviewed the case file with growing concern. The arrest report was sloppy, the search seemed questionable, and the young man's clean record suggested this might be his first real mistake. Marcus had seen too many promising futures derailed by overzealous policing and mandatory minimums. He'd also seen too many officers who believed their badge gave them authority beyond the law. As morning turned to afternoon, the courtroom filled with the usual cast of characters. Jerome sat beside his attorney, his parents in the front row behind him. His mother clutched a worn Bible, and his father kept checking his watch. He'd taken time off from his job at the automotive plant. They'd saved for months to afford decent legal representation. Understanding that their son's future hung in the balance, Ray entered the courthouse just before the hearing, his chest tight with anticipation. He'd testify about what he saw, what he found, and why the arrest was justified. In his mind, the facts were simple. Wrong place, wrong time, drugs in possession. End of story. What bothered him wasn't the case itself, but the judge assigned to hear it. Marcus Williams had a reputation that preceded him. Some officers called him fair but tough, while others whispered that he was too soft on criminals and always looking for reasons to let them walk. Ray had appeared before Judge Williams twice before, and both times felt like the judge was scrutinizing him more than the defendants. It's not that Marcus was hostile, he was professionally courteous to everyone in his courtroom, but Ray sensed something beneath that judicial calm. The bailiff called the court to order, and Marcus took his place behind the bench. His eyes swept the courtroom with practiced efficiency, noting the nervous family, the confident defense attorney, and the prosecutor who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. When his gaze landed on Detective Morrison, something flickered, recognition perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of a familiar face. The prosecutor presented the state's case with routine efficiency. Possession of marijuana, illegal search and seizure claims, the usual dance between law enforcement authority and constitutional protections. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes, asking clarifying questions that made both lawyers sharpen their arguments. When Detective Morrison took the witness stand, the tension in the room shifted subtly. Ray straightened his uniform and spoke clearly about the arrest, but Marcus's questions grew more pointed. Where exactly was the defendant walking? What specific behaviors suggested criminal activity? Was the search conducted according to department protocol? Each question felt like a challenge to Ray's professional judgment. "Detective Morrison," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly, "help me understand the timeline here. You observed Mr. Washington for how long before initiating contact?" Ray's jaw tightened. "Long enough to establish reasonable suspicion, Your Honor. And that suspicion was based on what specific actions?" The courtroom fell silent. Ray could feel sweat gathering under his collar. He was in a known drug area, acting nervous, looking around like he was expecting something. "Acting nervous," Marcus repeated, making a note. "Can you describe what nervous behavior looks like, Detective?" Something in the judge's tone struck Ray the wrong way. It felt like mockery, like this privileged man in his fancy robes was questioning 22 years of street experience. Ray's voice hardened almost imperceptibly. "With respect, Your Honor, some things you learn from experience, not from books." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus looked up from his notes, his expression unreadable. But those who knew him well, the court staff, the regular attorneys, recognized the subtle shift in his demeanor. In that moment, both men felt the ground shifting beneath them. Though neither could have predicted where it would lead, the hearing recessed for lunch. But the tension from that morning exchange lingered like storm clouds. Ray Morrison pushed through the courthouse doors, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. 22 years of service, and some judge was making him look like a fool in front of a courtroom full of people. The autumn air bit at his face as he stood on the courthouse steps, watching lawyers and families disperse for the lunch break. Judge Marcus Williams remained in his chambers, door closed, staring at the case file spread across his desk. Jerome Washington's school transcripts showed a 3.7 GPA in engineering. Letters of recommendation from professors painted a picture of a young man with real promise. The marijuana charge would derail his financial aid, potentially ending his college dreams before they truly began. Marcus had seen it happen too many times. One mistake, one overzealous arrest, one mandatory sentence, destroying futures that communities desperately needed to nurture. But something else gnawed at Marcus as he reviewed Detective Morrison's testimony. That phrase, "some things you learn from experience, not from books," carried an undertone that felt familiar and ugly. It was the kind of coded language Marcus had heard his entire career, the subtle way some people dismissed his intelligence, his qualifications, his right to question their actions. He'd learned to recognize it in corporate boardrooms before law school, in courtrooms as a young attorney, even from colleagues who smiled to his face. Ray sat in his patrol car, replaying the morning's events. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Judge Williams had asked the kind of questions that made a cop look bad, the kind that defense attorneys loved and prosecutors hated. It felt personal somehow, like the judge was grinding an axe at Ray's expense. The detective's mind wandered to conversations he'd had with other officers about certain judges, certain attitudes, certain assumptions about who was really on the side of law and order. When court reconvened, the atmosphere felt charged. Jerome Washington looked between his parents, drawing strength from their quiet support. His mother had whispered a prayer during recess, reminding him that this was just one moment in his life, not the definition of it. His father had squeezed his shoulder and said simply, "Keep your head up, son. Truth has a way of coming out." Marcus resumed his questioning with professional detachment, but Ray felt every inquiry like a personal attack. The judge asked about department policies regarding searches, about the specific training officers received on constitutional protections, about whether Ray had considered alternatives to arrest. Each question seemed designed to highlight what Ray saw as technicalities and what Marcus understood as fundamental rights. "Detective Morrison," Marcus said, consulting his notes, "you mentioned that Mr. Washington appeared nervous. In your experience, are there legitimate reasons why a young black man might appear nervous when approached by police?" The question hit the courtroom like a physical force. Ray's face flushed red, and several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor looked up sharply from her notes, sensing dangerous territory. Jerome's parents exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about their own experiences. Ray's voice came out harder than he intended. "I don't see color when I'm doing my job, Your Honor. I see suspicious behavior." Marcus set down his pen and looked directly at the detective. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of measured responses to such claims. "Detective Morrison, I appreciate that you believe you approach your duties without bias. But surely you're aware that perception and reality don't always align. That unconscious assumptions can influence our actions even when we have good intentions." Ray stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor, I've spent my career protecting this community. I've bled for this badge, and I won't sit here while my integrity gets questioned by someone who's never walked a beat, never faced down a drug dealer, never had to make split-second decisions that could save lives." The outburst sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The bailiff moved instinctively toward Ray, while the court reporter's fingers flew across her machine. Marcus remained seated, his expression calm, but his eyes flashing with something dangerous. "Detective Morrison," Marcus said quietly, "you will lower your voice and show proper respect for this court, or you will be held in contempt." But Ray was past caring about consequences. Months of frustration, years of feeling unappreciated, decades of watching the world change around him in ways that felt like personal attacks. All of it boiled over in that moment. "Respect?" Ray's voice cracked with anger. "You want to talk about respect? I risk my life every day while you sit up there in your ivory tower making decisions that put criminals back on the street. You don't know what it's like out there. You don't know what real police work looks like." Marcus stood slowly, his 6-foot frame imposing even in judicial robes. "Detective Morrison, you are in contempt of this court. You will—" "Don't tell me what I will and won't do," Ray interrupted, pointing a finger at Marcus. "You think that robe makes you better than me. You think your fancy education gives you the right to judge men who've actually served this community." The words spilled out before Ray could stop them, each one more damaging than the last. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as people processed what they were witnessing. Jerome Washington sat frozen, watching his future hang in the balance, while two grown men's conflict played out before him. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd faced racism before, but rarely so blatantly, never in his own courtroom. The disrespect stung, but what hurt more was seeing Jerome's face, a young man watching the system that was supposed to protect him tear itself apart with ugly truths. "Detective Morrison," Marcus said, his voice carrying quiet authority, You will remove yourself from my courtroom immediately, or I will have you removed." This hearing will resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. As Ray finally turned to leave, his face burning with embarrassment and rage, he muttered something under his breath that only the people in the front rows could hear clearly. But those who caught it would never forget the venom in his voice, or the way Judge Williams's composure finally cracked just slightly around the edges. The evening news picked up the story within hours. Courthouse confrontation raises questions about police-community relations played across television screens throughout Riverside County. The footage, captured by someone's cell phone, showed Detective Morrison's outburst in grainy detail, but it couldn't capture the full weight of what everyone in that courtroom had felt. Marcus drove home through familiar neighborhoods, past the elementary school where his mother had taught third grade for 30 years, past the corner barbershop where old Mr. Henderson still gave him grief about his hairline. These streets held his history: Little League games, first dates, the celebration when he passed the bar exam. Tonight, they felt different somehow, as if the confrontation had shifted something fundamental about his place in this community. At home, Marcus's wife, Elena, was waiting with a cup of coffee and the kind of understanding that came from 32 years of marriage. She'd heard the news, seen the worry lines deepen around her husband's eyes, and knew without being told that this wasn't just about one angry detective or one marijuana case. "Talk to me," she said simply, settling beside him on their front porch swing. Marcus sipped his coffee and watched the sunset paint their neighborhood in golden hues. "Do you remember when I first became a judge? How proud Daddy would have been." His father had died 2 years before Marcus's appointment, never getting to see his son wear judicial robes. "He knew," Elena said softly. "He saw it coming long before you did. Today in that courtroom, I felt like I was right back in law school, having to prove I belonged there, having to justify my right to ask questions, to expect respect, to do my job." Marcus's voice carried decades of accumulated fatigue. "I thought we were past this. I thought wearing this robe meant something." Elena reached for his hand. "It does mean something. To Jerome Washington, to his parents, to every family that's counting on the system to work fairly. Don't let one man's ignorance make you forget that." Meanwhile, across town, Ray Morrison sat in his den, surrounded by commendations and photos from his police career. His wife, Sarah, had tried to start a conversation about the day's events, but Ray had shut down, retreating into angry silence. His teenage daughter had texted him a link to the news story with a simple message. "Dad, what happened?" Ray stared at his phone, unable to answer. What had happened? One moment he was testifying in a routine drug case, and the next he was shouting at a judge in open court, watching 22 years of reputation crumble in real time. The worst part wasn't the embarrassment or even the potential consequences to his career. It was the look in Jerome Washington's eyes. Confusion, fear, disappointment in the very system the young man had been taught to respect. The next morning brought protesters to the courthouse steps. Not angry mobs, but concerned citizens holding signs reading "Justice for All" and "Respect our judges." Local ministers stood alongside college students and retired teachers, united in their disappointment over what they'd witnessed. The demonstration was peaceful but pointed, a community's way of saying that some behavior couldn't be tolerated, even from those who wore badges. Ray watched the coverage from his kitchen table, his uniform hanging pressed and ready, but his will to wear it shaken. His captain had called twice, his union representative once, and his lawyer 3 times. The words suspension, investigation, and anger management swirled through conversations he wasn't ready to have. Sarah finally broke the silence over breakfast. "Ray, I've known you for 25 years. The man I married wouldn't have done what you did yesterday. So what's really going on here?" The question hit him like a physical blow because it forced him to confront truths he'd been avoiding. The job had changed, or maybe he'd changed, or maybe both. The neighborhoods he'd once patrolled with pride now felt foreign to him. The community he'd sworn to serve seemed to view him with suspicion he couldn't understand. And somewhere along the way, protecting and serving had become us versus them. "I don't know who I am anymore," Ray admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I believed about this job, about right and wrong, about my place in this community, it all feels upside down." Back in his chambers, Marcus prepared for the day's continuation of the Washington hearing. But first, he'd asked to meet privately with Jerome and his parents. The young man sat nervously across from the judge's desk while his parents flanked him protectively. "Jerome," Marcus began, "what happened yesterday in my courtroom was unacceptable. And I want you to know that it doesn't represent the values of this court or this justice system at its best." Jerome nodded, but his father spoke up. "Your Honor, with all due respect, maybe it represents exactly what this system is. Maybe yesterday was just the first time someone said out loud what a lot of folks have been thinking quietly." Marcus felt the weight of that observation. "Mr. Washington, you're not wrong. And that's exactly why what happens next matters so much. Not just for Jerome's case, but for this community's faith in justice itself." He turned to Jerome directly. "Son, I've read your transcripts, your professor's letters. You have a bright future ahead of you, and one mistake with a small amount of marijuana shouldn't derail that future. But more than that, you have the right to be treated with dignity and respect by every officer, every court, every part of this system. What Detective Morrison did yesterday violated that right." Jerome's mother wiped away tears she'd been holding back for days. "Your Honor, we taught our boy to respect authority, to trust the system, to believe that if he worked hard and stayed out of trouble, he'd be treated fairly. After yesterday, Marcus interrupted gently, "I hope you'll teach him that the system is made up of people, and people make mistakes. But also that there are mechanisms for accountability, for change, for making things right when they go wrong." As the Washington family left his chambers, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This case had become about much more than marijuana possession. It was about whether justice could survive personal prejudice, whether institutions could evolve beyond the flaws of the people who staffed them, and whether a community could heal from the ugly truths that sometimes surfaced in courtrooms and on courthouse steps. The packed courtroom buzzed with nervous energy when Judge Marcus Williams called the session to order. News crews lined the back wall, community leaders filled the gallery, and every attorney in town seemed to have found an excuse to observe the proceedings. Jerome Washington sat beside his lawyer, drawing strength from his parents' presence while trying to ignore the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Detective Ray Morrison was notably absent from the witness stand, but his impact lingered in the tense atmosphere. Marcus had spent the previous evening reviewing not just the case law surrounding searches and seizures, but the deeper questions about how justice should function when trust between communities and law enforcement had been shattered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority earned through 15 years on the bench, "yesterday's proceedings were disrupted by behavior that has no place in any courtroom. Today, we will focus solely on the legal questions before us. Guided by the law and by our commitment to fairness, the prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable with the attention her routine drug case had attracted, presented a streamlined version of the state's argument. But when she called Detective Morrison to continue his testimony, the courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said quietly, "Detective Morrison is not available to testify today." Marcus nodded gravely. "Very well. The court will proceed with the evidence already presented." But what he didn't share was the conversation he'd had that morning with Police Chief Margaret Santos, a conversation that revealed Detective Morrison had been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal investigation of his conduct. Chief Santos had been direct during their private meeting. "Judge Williams, what happened in your courtroom yesterday was unacceptable. Detective Morrison's behavior violated every principle of professional conduct we expect from our officers. The department will conduct a thorough investigation, and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. Marcus had appreciated the chief's swift response, but he'd also been careful to emphasize that the court's decision would be based solely on legal merits, not on anyone's personal conduct. Chief Santos, I want you to know that my ruling in this case will be based entirely on the evidence and the law. Detective Morrison's behavior, while deeply concerning, doesn't change my obligation to evaluate this case fairly. Now, as Marcus reviewed the evidence without the distraction of personal conflict, the legal questions became crystal clear. The search that led to Jerome's arrest had been conducted without proper probable cause. The detective's testimony, even before yesterday's outburst, had been vague about specific behaviors that justified reasonable suspicion. The constitutional protections that Jerome enjoyed as an American citizen had been compromised. In the matter of State versus Jerome Washington, Marcus announced, "This court finds that the search conducted by Detective Morrison violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. The evidence obtained during that search is therefore inadmissible." Jerome's mother gasped softly, while his father reached over to squeeze his son's shoulder. The prosecutor nodded with resigned professionalism. She'd known this outcome was likely once the judge began questioning the search's validity. "The charges against Mr. Washington are hereby dismissed," Marcus continued. "However, I want to address something broader than this individual case." The courtroom fell silent as Marcus looked out over the assembled crowd. When he spoke, it was with the voice of someone who'd spent decades watching the justice system work and fail, succeed and stumble. What happened in this courtroom yesterday reminded us all that justice is not automatic. It requires constant vigilance, continuous commitment, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our institutions. Mr. Washington deserved better than he received from this system initially. Not because of his grades or his potential, though both are impressive, but simply because he is a citizen entitled to constitutional protections. Marcus paused, letting his words settle. The badge Detective Morrison wears represents a sacred trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Yesterday, that trust was damaged. But trust can be rebuilt through accountability, through training, through genuine efforts to address the unconscious biases that affect us all. In the gallery, several community leaders nodded approvingly. These weren't radical activists or professional protesters, but long-time residents who remembered when police officers knew their names, attended their church services, and worked collaboratively to solve neighborhood problems. After court adjourned, Marcus found himself approached by Reverend Patricia Johnson, whose church had organized the peaceful demonstration. "Judge Williams," she said, "what you did in there today, holding everyone accountable while still treating that young officer's situation with compassion, that's what leadership looks like." Meanwhile, across town, Ray Morrison sat in Chief Santos's office, facing the consequences of his courtroom meltdown. The internal affairs investigation had been swift but thorough, interviewing witnesses, reviewing his recent arrest reports, and examining patterns of behavior that yesterday's incident had brought into sharp focus. "Ray," Chief Santos said, her voice carrying both disappointment and genuine concern, "you're suspended without pay for 30 days. You'll complete anger management counseling, undergo bias training, and work with a department therapist to address whatever underlying issues led to yesterday's behavior." Ray wanted to protest, to argue that he was being railroaded, but the words wouldn't come. The cell phone footage of his outburst, played endlessly on local news, had shown him a version of himself he didn't recognize and didn't like. "Chief," he said finally, "I know I screwed up. I know I embarrassed the department and disrespected the court. But I need you to know I'm not a racist. I've worked with officers of every background, protected citizens of every color. I don't know what happened to me in there." Chief Santos studied him carefully. "Ray, intent matters, but so does impact. Your words and actions yesterday caused real harm to real people. But if you're truly committed to understanding and changing, this department will support that growth. The question is whether you're ready to do the hard work required. For the first time in years, Ray Morrison felt something crack open inside his chest. Not anger or frustration, but the possibility of redemption through genuine accountability and change. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Community Baptist Church's Fellowship Hall, where an unlikely gathering was taking place. The monthly Coffee and Conversation series had become one of Riverside County's most surprising success stories, a forum where police officers, community members, judges, and activists met to discuss the complicated work of building trust and understanding. Judge Marcus Williams sat at a round table with 5 other people, including Jerome Washington, who was now finishing his sophomore year in engineering with a clean record and renewed faith in the system's capacity for fairness. Across from them sat Detective Ray Morrison, who looked different somehow, humbled, more thoughtful, his edges softened by months of counseling and genuine self-reflection. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Ray's 30-day suspension had stretched into 6 months of intensive work with department counselors, community service with local youth organizations, and participation in bias training that had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about unconscious assumptions he'd carried for decades. The angry, defensive man who'd exploded in Marcus's courtroom had slowly given way to someone more honest about his own limitations and more committed to growth. "I want to thank everyone for being here," said Reverend Johnson, who'd organized the monthly gatherings after the courthouse incident sparked community-wide conversations about police relations. "Today marks 6 months since events that could have divided our community permanently. Instead, we've chosen to use them as a foundation for something better.